and welcome to Our People, the podcast where we give space for Holdeman Stories. We focus on hope, healing, and inspiration. Connection, consciousness, and love are the driving motivations for this project. Remember to have grace for those who have chosen to speak out and share their experience. Please enjoy the story you will hear today. Welcome to Our People, the podcast where we give ex-Holdemans a place to share their stories. I'm Weylin, and I'm here today with Chris. Chris, would you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Yes. Hi, Weylin. First of all, I would really like to thank you for facilitating this podcast. I think everybody's story is absolutely important, and my wish is just like yours for healing and hope, and just to share what my journey has been. And my journey isn't over. I haven't arrived yet at all the places I want to be. So just keep that in mind. So just as a framework, so my journey might involve a little bit more of the psychological journey I've been on. Many well-known and not so well-known teachers and authors that have influenced my thinking over the years. But just as a framework, I'll go ahead and tell a little bit about my background. It kind of helps to place one. So I grew up in central Kansas. I had a pretty lovely childhood as far as I knew. A lot of outdoors. I grew up in a family of 4 girls. I was the youngest. And my dad farmed, and he had cattle sometimes too. So it involved a lot of helping my dad on the farm. So that was a setting. Had lots of animals, made hay. Alfalfa hay is one of my favorite scents. And drove truck for the wheat harvest, all of those things. So I really had a good childhood as far as I could tell. My family, my dad had some significant setbacks in his farming that weren't necessarily his fault. I remember one year the water well went bad, and he actually lost 25 of his dairy cattle, or young cattle, even moving up into production. So as I look back in my life, I realized how poverty did play a part, but I didn't even really realize it then. So a lot of analysis has come later on in life, but that is a little bit of my setting. I didn't have a lot of real chummy friends like within the Holdemans at that point. I had other relatives who were not Holdemans, so that I had exposure to people I loved and enjoyed who were not Holdeman church members. A part of me is that from early on, very early on in the my going to church life, I would question and observe pretty much everything, and I never felt really comfortable at all, just in the whole church building itself, like going to church. I was from a very large church, so maybe that probably played a part. I was generally pretty shy and introverted. And we can also talk about introversion versus extroversion. So there is this saying that religion reflects the personality of the founder. So in later years, I've often thought that John Holdeman must have been an extrovert, because going through youth life, and I think it's probably pretty much that way. The extroverts did a little bit better socially, and I would have a little bit of background of this as well. I heard of a kind of a personality analysis that quite a large group of older single Holdemans took once. I think it was about 30 of them, and the majority of them who were unmarried and single beyond, kind of into their late 20s, 30s, were introverts. And that kind of cemented and helped me understand my feelings, and that they were probably right in my observations. So in my journey, I probably will focus on the psychological aspects of religion or religiosity, and then just kind of use my own personal experiences as a bit of more of a framework or background. So one way to understand John Holdeman is his religion arose in the 1800s when the birth of many religions came to be, including Mormonism, Seventh-day Adventists, Jehovah's Witnesses, and Christian Scientists. It was called the Second Great Awakening. And the fact is, I believe that he had had a child before they were married. So I often wonder whether it was a reaction of somewhat guilt and who knows what led him into, founding this religion and finding a foothold among these really poor Russian immigrants. I listened to a documentary that I would highly recommend. I listened to it off of Prime Video, and it was about highly sensitive people. And I actually had just listened to this recently, but it resonated with me. So by scientific data, they have determined that about 20% of the general human population are highly sensitive people. They may stand in the background, they may appear shy or not interacting as much as others, but they're just taking it all in. They take it in more internally. They actually feel people's negative energy. They observe a lot more closely. And I've had to wonder whether that's kind of what we're seeing among the Holdemans, is that maybe the other 80% can kind of go along with all of the hypocrisies and doctrines and that type of thing and not question them so much. But the more sensitive people are thinking more deeply and sensing the discrepancies and like I said, the hypocrisy behind these. Also, I just in observation, I'm a very experiential person. Like through my journey, it's like I kind of place where what have I actually felt? What do I actually know versus what I have been told to feel or told to know? So one of those is that a lot of people are marginalized, and sometimes it's the really poor people, and probably the introverts that got pushed a little toward the sides of the mainstream within that group. But another gift that was really given to me in childhood, and I have absolutely no idea where this came from, but like I said, I always thought deeply. I think way back from early on. And I'll tell a bit of my mother's story where it may have roots in. But one of the gifts that was given to me is I would look in the mirror and I would the words would come to me over and over that I am what I am. And that is what I have come to over the years as well, is that I am what I am. I don't need to put anything on my head. I don't need to dress in a certain way. I don't need to do the things that other people say you have to do. I am what I am. And I recognize that that's the same for every other human being. They are who they are. They are good. So you might also go on the theological rabbit trail of inherent goodness or inherent badness. So I tend to think, the creation was good. Being a human, being in a body is good. There's goodness in that. The body isn't bad, and you have to be good to get to heaven. So, and I'll tell a bit of my mother's story that happened when I was about age 7, and I didn't analyze this till decades later, but I believe the conclusions I've come to are valid. So I was age 7 during the panel days, so about 1976, and probably the most dramatic upheaval in my home that I first remember, and I didn't realize all this was going on. All I knew is there was a lot of tension. And one evening, my mother was walking back and forth and crying, and all I knew is my dad finally went to the telephone and made a phone call. But in piecing it all together later, they had been called into the panel. And the way I understand this happened was a whole group of ministers sitting there, and you would go in by yourself or as a couple, I'm not quite sure, but they would grill you over whether you had done anything wrong or something like that. I don't know. But my mother had been abused as a young girl, as a child, and never had any help with that. So, and she got married at the age of 18, moved from California to central Kansas. And I think about her, she loved my father dearly all their life, and she just worked so hard on the farm. And she was a gentle, loving, beautiful soul. And what she really needed was love and acceptance. And I think it was hard for her coming into such a large congregation and probably having difficulty being accepted. I mean, having to work so hard on the farm, and then being a tender, gentle soul. You walk into this room with all of these men, and it's almost a projection. I'll talk later about the psychological aspect of projection. And I think it happens more than we know in that setting, and especially during the panel days. A soft, gentle soul like my mother just felt this negative energy. And it's almost like you're compelled to dredge something up. And she became anxious about a nothing that had happened years and years ago before they were even married. And just the little bit I know of it, it was nothing. It really wasn't any great sin or anything like that. But the way I understand is the ministers took it that, well, if it was brought to your mind, then it needs to be dealt with. And she was expelled for it. And me as a 7-year-old, I think that was just such an age to go through this. I remember her sitting at a separate table. I couldn't understand it. And being the sensitive person, all these negative emotions in the house, stress, sadness, and then I remember her trying to come to some type of a experience. And this tiny thing that had happened, she had even talked to her minister brother about before she got married. And he said, oh, it's nothing. It's fine. It's all forgiven. But then when she brought this up to the panel, this is what happened. But the result of this was that in the Mennonite church, or the German background, there was this term called Chevillegeist, and it meant a tormenting spirit. And really, I think what happened with my mother was she was having this anxiety, and this came up, and being expelled for this reinforced that spirit. So I will just say that my next probably 4 years were just pretty difficult as a child, because she didn't trust herself at all. I mean, she would have angst over going to the grocery store, whether she had said everything just right to the cashier. It was a real mental illness that she went through. And I really feel like the church instigated that by their practice. And then too, even later through all this, she didn't receive the love and acceptance that would have helped her. So that is a pretty dramatic. And so coming to probably my tapping into the psychology of things probably started in those years, those kind of formative years. So that kind of brings at about the age of 8, I did make myself some notes here. So also kind of back to the psychology of all this, also when someone unconsciously attributes their own thoughts. So manipulation is when you, like, let's say the ministers in a meeting attribute their own thoughts and feelings or behaviors, they project them onto another person. So they're almost expecting people to come up with negative things as they grill them. So that's a projection that is really hard for some people to analyze and stand up against. And a projection is also when someone unconsciously is assigning their own negative traits or unwanted emotions to others without even being aware that they are doing so. And symptoms can be found in making unfounded accusations and being overly critical. And I will just kind of insert a bit of my experience with projections. Way back, I didn't say when I had left the church, but I left in about 2013. I had been leaving and asking questions for a very long time, but I was probably actually excommunicated in 2013. And during that time, there were huge projections. So kind of jumping back and forth, but to explain what a projection is, in that case, when I left, they even asked, and I heard this firsthand from the family of the individual involved. They went and asked whether I had been having an affair with somebody, which was totally ungrounded, not a bit of truth. But they were projecting their negative thoughts onto me in that case and trying to come up with, validation for their unfounded accusations. And also in that process, another person I heard had said that I was leaving just to get attention. And in that, I would say definitely she was projecting her own shadow side or her own negative part of her personality onto me, because that was not true. So kind of back to the chronological framework of my experience. At the age of 8, I had been going to a public school, which was just great. First and second grade, little country school. I was just learning school things, not too much complicated about that. And then at the age of 8, the church purchased the school and it got changed to a parochial school. And that totally changed. I would say mostly my school life from then on did have quite a negative tinge to it. There was a lot of cliques and marginalization of certain people within the class I was in. And then I would also view that perhaps even worse at the beginning of these parochial schools, very untrained teachers, unprepared to care for difficult learning disabilities or difficult situations. And I think that actually through the years, that would be my concern for the children, is that they're receiving an education from very young, very unprepared teachers, and they potentially actually receive a bit of harm from that, in especially the ones who have difficulties, the ones who are just straight A students and brilliant and extroverts probably breeze right through. But the ones that have difficulty need more TLC and less judgment. Then at about the age of 11, I remember attending revival meetings at the big church. And this very emotional preacher preached. And I knew some of my classmates had been joining church for that term. And I really, on that evening, I remember it crystal clear, the dress I was wearing, everything. It was totally an emotional thing. It was one of those ministers who could really, he was a tearjerker, I'll tell you. And the way I remember is it was probably like a hellfire sermon. And I stood, and it was all, looking back, it was just so strange psychologically. I just remember getting in the car and my dad turning around and kind of sympathetically telling me, "Oh, you're feeling bad, aren't you?" And then trying to come to some feeling. That's the only thing I can remember about that time. Like, kind of making little confessions about maybe a little untruth here, a little untruth there, and then praying, trying to come to this feeling of peace. Because once you start on this path, there is external pressure to complete this path. So I did, I remember praying once and then lifting my head, and the room seemed really bright. And I just grasped on that and hoped that that was my peace, because I needed to get this wrapped up in order to progress with these other people. And I didn't think of it technically like that, but that pressure was there, and subconsciously without even knowing it. So I was baptized, and I remember, so at the age of 11, I don't even remember going over the vows before then. But that was a very serious thing that I looked at when I left the church, is here I have made this vow to a church. But my conclusion with that is that the age of 11 and not being informed, I am not held to that vow. And that was a big thing of contention when I left the church as well. The bit about baptizing children as young as 9. And I was in a meeting when there was this, listen to this tiny little experience. It was so tiny about emotions. And even the name of Christ wouldn't even be said. It would basically be, I made confessions and I was forgiven and found peace. Like, and then this child was baptized. And I remember turning to some of my fellow sisters and saying, it made me really uncomfortable. And the funny thing was, numerous ones of them said they were uncomfortable, but we had all raised our hands. So that's groupthink. And where can groupthink take you if you follow it? Everybody's feeling uncomfortable, but they know they can't stay sitting. They know they can't not raise their hand, because then that will kind of put the spotlight on them and potentially bring questioning that they aren't ready to deal with at that point. Another major part of my psychological journey in relation to the church was the very first members meeting I attended after being baptized at the age of 11. There was a case brought up and a person was expelled for, and they'll use their generic terms. And in the Holdeman church, sexuality has a huge dark shadow. So, but I do think it was actually harmful at the age of 11. It was a pretty variant sexual sin, you might say. And of course, they use their generic terms in church, but kind of gossip or your friends or whoever kind of filled in the blanks. And at that point, at the age of 11, I don't think you should have to bear even knowing that type of thing exists. So that is another thing that I really look at and see that I just totally had an aversion to members meetings from then on. It would be this whole, like, you could tell the quietness that would come over the congregation when the minister would start his little preparation to bringing up this case. And to me, being sensitive and analytical, and I would look at, maybe not physically, but I would be so tuned into the energy. And you could hear a pin drop. And by that, I knew it was hooking. Like this subject of sexuality really hooks something in the brain. And I just internally hated those meetings. And just from my perspective, that is so wrong. I think if people have done things privately that they need to repent of, they need to do that for their own good. And it shouldn't be brought on anybody else to participate in standing or raising their hand or anything, participating in any way in expelling that person or saying, okay, they're now okay. That would be one of my huge moments of enlightenment as I allowed myself to think about that and feel that was really harmful and wrong. So going on kind of chronologically, just my youth life, it was very superficial and confusing to me, to be honest. I always hungered for genuine conversations and really never could have those. Another observation that I felt pressured or marginalized about was singing and the whole instrument thing. I love music now. I listen to just How Great Thou Art station on podcast to and from work all the time. It just enriches my soul. And the whole thing about it seemed to be very prideful, very exclusive. And I really had a heart for the people who weren't included in the singing. Everyone can sing. They can sing from the heart. It doesn't need to be a special few. And that's something I've held for a very long time about the meetings at church, like especially the volunteer meetings or those type of things. There seems to be a real energy and, whether you can sing or not and that type of thing. So, and then moving on, just some of the podcasts, I have heard people verbalize their anxiety related to actually attending church. And I would say I absolutely felt that. I did not feel comfortable. It was just soul crushing to me to hear this sermon. I was very sensitive. Sometimes I'd be close to tears and then turn around, the little turnaround in the benches and have to talk absolutely superficially to someone. And I guess I will be transparent here. About in 2010, I changed churches to a smaller church. I changed my membership. And I was kind of thinking, oh, that's going to be more close and more, it maybe was, but I really tapped into this whole spiritual immaturity thing that is a part of the Holdemans. Because of their top-down kind of hierarchy, that type of thing, it really doesn't allow people to develop. I've actually had the thought that even having this emotional experience as young as 11, it actually kind of arrests a person's natural development. Like they really need to be nurtured, brought up to be mature, self-standing, being able to stand on their own 2 feet spiritually. And I found in this other church just a real immaturity. You could just feel it. It was it was being really nice. But the depth absolutely wasn't there. I'm a nurse. I remember one instance where I was caring for a child in a shelter, a woman's shelter in the local town. And this woman had absolutely nothing. I mean, she needed a home, a car, a job, everything. And I remember some Holdeman women coming to the door and offering blankets. And this woman needed a whole lot more. And that's okay if you're just going to offer blankets, but don't think you're being great and godly by doing that would kind of be my view of that, because they need so much more. They actually need a part of you. And just checking my notes here a little bit, and like I said, just kind of being good and nice. So that was about in 2010. Even when I had been in the other church, I had started asking questions. And later on in my notes, I have a more comprehensive list of all of the things that just I found to be hypocritical. One of the an interesting anecdote that I absolutely never could come to grips with the head covering, to be honest. It was supposed to be a prayer covering. I remember sitting in Sunday school in the larger church once, which we had a male teacher, the women couldn't teach. And I simply asked a question on my heart. I said, I am laying in bed at night and I do not have my head covering on and I want to pray. And there is just something in me and I was looking at myself, like, am I not willing to get up and go get a head covering and put it on before I can pray? And yet to me, that wasn't being 100% honest, because in my heart, I knew deep down that that was not necessary. And so I was saying this in this group. I was saying, I just cannot get up and go get a head covering. And one of the older ladies said, oh no, you don't have to. You can just put the sheet over your head. I thought, this is insane, And so I brought that up, and I didn't say that I thought it was insane in the moment she was saying that. And then the teacher even said, yeah, I often wondered about that. My wife will often put a napkin on her head when we're going to pray and before the meal. So I have a view that I've come to in this issue about the head covering. And after I left, we don't need we are who we are. It's back to that statement of I am that I am. I don't need anything on my head. I am made how I am. I can pray whenever I want to. I don't need to feel guilty about walking down the street without my head covering on. That was another huge part that I really delved into, the truth. I could be without my head covering in the house and feel just fine. Going out into the yard, I started feeling a little uncomfortable. If I walked to the mailbox, I felt really uncomfortable. And I analyzed for myself, what is that feeling? What it was a discomfort in thinking that another Mennonite would see me. So it was people pleasing. It had nothing to do with God at all. So that was a part of my journey, but it was a huge part. And actually, when I left the church, that and wearing dresses, and that would kind of be my criteria about any religion, is how do they make their women dress? And it is pretty much control. That was absolutely the only thing. I remember that when I left the church, that was the last thing one of the ministers who called me said was that, well, but you must wear a head covering and dresses. And of course, to keep their group together, they must. But that was really the only thing they had to say in that last phone call. So I could go through just a little bit more about the psychology. So leading up, before I actually left the church, and I made a very clean departure. I had delved into this deeply, trying to see the truth. One of my deep studies was into Carl Jung. He was a psychoanalyst from 1875 to 1961. Last name is spelled Jung. He was a Swiss psychiatrist. He founded analytical psychology. He talked about individuation, which is a lifelong psychological process of differentiating the false self and the true self. And I will just intercept in here. Often the fears of leaving a closed group, of the security, the society, the social connections, those fears are most likely rooted in the false self. It's self-protectionism and fear of who or what or how you're going to be without this system that you think is sustaining you. But in reality, it actually isn't, because we're all individuals anyway. Jung also wrote many books. One is Psychology and Religion, among many others, but that would be one that I read, and I understood that a lot of religion happens up in your brain, to be honest. Like back to the experience that you might have as a young child. It is generated a lot through the brain waves. Jung was the one that we have to thank for coining the terms extroversion and introversion. So if you've ever heard those terms, you are giving homage to Jung, actually. He talks a lot about the shadow self. So the shadow is the unconscious part of the personality that contains repressed weaknesses, desires, and instincts, and represents the part of ourselves that we deny or ignore. Confronting the shadow can lead to greater self-awareness and personal growth. And I think that's a lot what the church does by trying to say they're good, the world is bad, and with their whole dealing with sexuality. And I'm not an expert, I'm on this journey, so I don't have all the answers. All I know is what I felt and experienced and understood in my experience in that environment. Even in the youth, that type of thing. It was odd, to be honest. I mean, in the youth, sometimes it almost seemed like a hypersexualization because of all the repression. And I'm not speaking from a point of advocating immorality. There's just a lot of dark energy. Every time you think of something as too wrong, it gains an extra dark energy that can come back through your shadow and kind of grab you unconsciously. So the shadow also is by acknowledging and accepting, you need to accept and acknowledge the shadow so it does not control behavior unconsciously. The thing the person has no wish to be. So that other person that you have absolutely no wish to be, and you feel the urge to gossip about or say negative things about, that's your shadow. You could be projecting, and I don't know about everybody else's experience, but there have been some really strange behaviors come out in this area, central Kansas, because of this shadow that turns around to grip people in secret because of, and I don't know if I have the words to describe it quite, but because of the repression and the pressure to appear good within the group. And this all needs to be denied and buried. It can come out in strange ways. And the shadow can also fuel prejudice. So the things that you absolutely don't want to be, you look at it as negative, those can come up as prejudices. So it's almost always encountered as a projection onto others. So I was describing the projections that happened when I left the church, or a projection. I've known people who will go into a minister's meeting and, not even know what's going to be thrown at them. And they'll bring him in again and again and say, well, something's just not right. Something's just not right. That is likely a projection. And you're probably never going to overcome it because it's rooted in the other person's psychology. And in those meetings, the ministers have all the power. That's one of the reasons when I left the church, I did it very cleanly. I just made a phone call, said, I am leaving for ideological reasons. And I was very clear that I did not ever have to go and sit in a meeting when it was a preconceived idea who was good and who was bad, because you would never overcome those psychological things. You can't change anybody else's mind. Your shadow can also contain qualities and energies and capacities as well. So it's kind of just helpful to look at it all. We're all humans. We're all just as we are. The worst thing that can happen is the shadow can become entwined with abandonment anxiety, leading to what I call the FFFF response, which is the flight, fright, freeze, or fawn response. And I've never seen all four of these words together, but just from my observation, even the fawning can actually take place a lot when you are feeling like you need to make sure that you're in the group, you're in the goodwill of other people, and you're just gonna be really nice and go along with anything they say. The process of assimilating the shadow leads to self-acceptance and self-forgiveness. So grievance and blame can give way to taking responsibility and attempts to sort things out. And a fierce conscience, which tends to be punitive, can relax. So, and I have seen this play out as well. We kind of have particular ones you might note in your community who will be very ready to send out reproving letters or that type of thing. They're probably really working at keeping their shadow behind them. It's kind of like a compulsion to prove that they're good or they're doing what they need to do to be saved or that type of thing. And that would be another thing that I would note, is that those kind, deep, loving relationships are not there. So it's really odd to go into a room with someone you've probably never talked to face and feel like they're they really care about you, or understand what you're going through, or there to help you. One experience I had like that was when I went to nursing school back in 1990, I think would have been when I was applying for LPN school. And I just did it. I needed to do it, that was my calling. And yet halfway through, I found out that I had to have a meeting with the ministers. So, that again was a whole sham to me. Um, I kind of took charge of the meeting because I was that kind of person. And then they told me, well, I kind of had a professionalist attitude. But and there too, let me just say this before I move on. I think there's been some reference to it in the podcast about the tendency to try to change the glare of that spotlight from yourself to someone else. So it's kind of, and I see that in myself. I probably did it a time or two when you're in those meetings to kind of bring up a concern about somebody else. It kind of, well, you're really concerned, you're a Christian, you're really concerned about this person. It kind of brings that glare off you. And it always fires, dopamine probably in your brain when you talk negative about someone else. It's like this feedback that is very unfortunate for humans. But something to watch out for people to understand what's happening psychologically in those meetings. So kind of moving on from all that, just my process. I just started studying Jung, really, really listening to myself, praying a lot, basically. But to be honest, that was another honesty thing. What did I usually get when I prayed? I mean, it was silence. But more recently, I've learned God can be in the silence. I think more now, Christ, energy. It doesn't need to be a particular name. It's the humming that underlies life is in the silence. And just to be very clear, as I have this platform, in my process of letting go, there were just several points. It was looking deep and being honest. That's just what I would want for everyone. Couple years before that, I had started reading just Christ's words, all the red in the Bible. And I was just like, this is not adding up, because to me, it seemed like a lot of judgment was continually piled up. Judgment against the world. Then it's never enough, It's judgment against the world, then it's judgment against church members, and then who finally is left, The one true church. It was very enlightening to me to realize that many religions say they're the only true one. And I would view here that often, we're taught not to be prideful personally, but then it's okay to be prideful on a organizational level. So I would think that would be a very worthy thing to think about and look at, is the individual requirements and the organizational requirements adding up and being the same completely across the platform. The treatment of women, dresses and head coverings, I felt far more modest when I was wearing jeans doing my farm work than otherwise. They would say, well, it's simplicity and modesty. But my view of the Holdemans now is I have sympathy for them. I hear over and over, women who stay up at night having to sew, meet these requirements. And there's many unwritten ones. Go have precise measurements done. That is not simplicity. And the form fitting, a nice skirt, blouse, slacks, shirt are 100% modest. So many unwritten rules. I remember one of the last communions I attended, it was like, do you take your hosiery off or don't you? And I was like, who makes these rules? I don't know. Last year we did this year we do this. It's really not Christ driven at all. I talked about the baptisms. One of the big things I looked at was the requirement for a filter on your phone or computer. So I never had a filter. I was very vocal at this. I would say, why should you have to have a filter? The filter should be on your heart. And I 100% stand behind that. If there is any propensity to visit websites that are harmful, it's in your heart already. You don't need a filter. But, it would kind of put in this little guilt thing too. You weren't supposed to go to communion without having this filter, but I didn't have the filter and but something to look at, shallowness, not being able to talk. I now attend a covenant church that has just been lovely. We have a women's meeting every week, and we're just able to talk about life, reality, difficult things, be a support, honesty, no judgment. It is real, and it is what my heart has always wanted. And so much social, like just socializing for social purposes, it's never fulfilling. It's like never enough. Just observe your own truth. Listen to what your heart is telling you. I will address this issue of depression. So there is good scientific evidence about this. If you go, you can even go on the nursing home websites and look at the Holdeman Mennonite nursing homes and look at their antipsychotic and their anti-anxiety medication usage. And I have heard from many levels that the antidepressant use among the church is high. And I can absolutely speak to this. I will be transparent and just tell my story. I have never been on antidepressants or anti-anxieties, but I will tell, I was so depressed after every Sunday. Sundays were terrible. You had to dress up in these certain dresses and wear this head covering, not one, but 2 head covering. Why? It's never enough. I remember one night I came home and I had a bottle of Ambien and I was so depressed, but I was strong deep in my heart. And I said, okay, we can deal with this temptation. And I flushed them all down the toilet. But that was a very powerful moment for me but I can speak to the depression and I don't think I'm alone. And I can definitely say being a whole person, being able to be a genuine, authentic person, no matter where I'm at, who I'm with, has alleviated that. Just observe for symptoms of egoism. One of the symptoms of egoism that I could note was, why did the ministers have to wear suits when they came and visited in your home? Or why did they have to wear suits when they came and visited in the nursing home? They were trying to put on something, some sense of power, something. It was a symptom of something. I'm not sure I can even name it, but just watch for those. Another thing I observed was that revivals would create this whole roller coaster effect in your spirituality. Being a nurse working, it was incredibly difficult for me to go to church every night. And then I would get some negative feedback about not being in church. That was very difficult. But it was this relief after it was over. Back in the day, revivals would last for 3 weeks at this large church. Incredibly exhausting. You were exhausted emotionally, if nothing else, by the end of it. And that's not good for your mental health. But it definitely created this roller coaster effect. I also remember attending a sermon specifically at the larger church, where it was a wonderful sermon about faith. Very clear. You are saved by faith alone. Just on and on about faith. And only thing I could think of when he ended was, but we have to wear head coverings and dresses. It's not by faith alone. We have to do this. Something isn't right. It's not adding up. And also the bit about in self-examination where we would say we love the church. So I love the church and the doctrines and that whole phrase. And it hardly would be even, I really did want toward the end to say, I love Christ. I love Christ. But that just wasn't acceptable. And I've heard in other people's experiences where that just would not have been acceptable. Let me turn on a light.
Great.
So those were all part of my real honest questions leading up to it. The funny thing was, after I had made the break, I had a fellow church member come up to me and said, you know what? You know, he tried to dissuade me from it, but then he says, you know what? There is something beautiful about it. You're no longer pretending. And I would agree, whether he really thought just I wasn't pretending, or could he see that they're all pretending? I don't know. You will suffer projections and persecutions. You know, there are some situations because you're expelled that you will never be right. You'll have these projections of negativity on you or dire predictions. Sadly, I remember someone saying, but what if you die in a horrible car crash? I pray that doesn't happen. Hasn't happened so far. They will circle the wagons and double down on their theology. I think they do that to this day. Some of the statements that that were thought-provoking that I found helpful through this process were, with people who were trying to dissuade me and talk to me, would be, you are only as wrong as you think you are right. Or you will not arrive in heaven as a church member. You will only be you, whoever you were, you know, however you were. I'm trying to, oh yes. So I don't know if we can get into deep theology, kind of like where I'm at now, but there is the potential that even heaven and hell may just be projections of the human mind. The Bible was written by humans, but we attempt to understand. It always tries to speak of something alluring, but if you really look at it, it's always trying to modify the behavior in the moment. I have come to believe that. I really believe in an energy. I call it the Christ spirit. I really believe that there's one river and many wells. I remember years ago being in Mexico, I was visiting there and listening to a minister preach, and it was a hot evening, and he was struggling with Spanish. So the sweat was pouring down, but his sermon was all about, to these native Mexicans, that religion is not a wheel. There aren't many paths to the center. There's only one path. And even in my 12-year-old mind, I was like, well, we all start so diversely. It's got to be a wheel. It's diverse. There's many paths. It depends largely how you're raised. A lot of it influences your thinking. There is a book by Matthew Fox, One River, Many Wells, that speaks to this, as there might be others. Also, during my process of leaving, I just thought of, I don't know if any of you are familiar with Carl Sagan. So my understanding was he was a scientist and involved in astrology and sending the Voyager out in space. And he had it turn around at the very edge of our universe and take a picture of the Earth. So there's this iconic photo of the whole Earth being a pale blue dot in a ray of sunshine. And in my actual visualization of trying to work through this, overcome all of these projections that were put on me from little on up about this religion, were thinking about the Holdemans on a timeline, like almost on a 4-dimensional level. Timeline, space, thinking about the vastness of space, and then the depth of the psyche. And the Holdeman church and their view of being the one true church is such a tiny, tiny speck on that big cosmological view. But check out Carl Sagan and the pale blue dot. So there were actually I had several wonderful friends that really just listened to me and helped me understand from an outside perspective as I went along. One of them was, and it's so it was just synchronicity and amazing how this all came together. And so I will read, if you bear with me here, if I can read something that was shared to me. And I'm actually not sure who the original author is, but this was shared to me as I was going through the difficult decision whether to leave or not. And it was shared by a dear friend. And it says, until one is committed, there is hesitancy, the chance to draw back, always ineffectiveness concerning all acts of initiative and creation. There is one elementary truth, the ignorance of which kills countless ideas and splendid plans. That the moment one definitely commits oneself, then providence moves too. All sorts of things occur to help one that would never otherwise have occurred. A whole stream of events issues from the decision, raising in one's favor all manner of unforeseen incidents and meetings and material assistance, which no man could have dreamt would have come his way. And then a quote from Goethe, Goethe, whatever you can do or dream you can, begin it. Boldness and genius has genius, power, and magic in it. So I would say just making a clean decision and trusting. It's like walking off the edge of a table with faith. I was introduced during this time to a very wonderful person, and his name is out there. He wrote a book. His name is out there in different ways. Jake Gearing. So he was a Jungian analyst of the Carl Jung psychoanalytic school. He actually attended the school in Switzerland for 2 years. But very coincidentally, he was also, so people who may be aware of the area, he grew up in Lone Tree Township. He was grew up right among the Holdemans, so he knew exactly. He was a part of the 1W service in Baltimore, Maryland. So he also accepted the couples that would come and give service in Baltimore, Maryland. So he was very known to them as well. At the time I learned to know him, he was probably about 90, but very sharp. And he had had a Jungian practice for many years. He had also been a psychotherapist, adhering to the Carl Rogers person-centered therapy school of thought, which is the Carl Rogers therapy is creating a supportive, non-judgmental therapeutic environment where the person feels accepted and understood. And the goal is for the client to develop self-awareness and self-acceptance to facilitate personal growth and self-discovery. The belief that the answers lie within the person. And he was very good at that, at just listening and maybe asking a question or two to really help the person come to the truth for themselves. At one point, he gave me this reading on unconditional love, and it just is so powerful. Jake passed away on his 101st birthday in 2019. But it's on unconditional love, and he himself says he doesn't know who the author was. But it says people who love unconditionally don't have the need to make demands or impose their viewpoints or opinions on others. They allow their loved ones and other people the freedom to be their best. Every person on earth's secret desire is to be the best they can be. This means that you will not judge anyone as to the correctness of their life or any action they take. You will not declare that what they say or do is wrong. You will not try to undermine their work or to speak badly about anyone else. It means that you speak truth. You say, this is how I see it, or this is what I felt, if there is a need to say anything. Most times, the less said, the better. Everyone would be. See, my children, love doesn't need words. It can be felt with a glance, a look, or a smile. Love is energy, and as energy, it brings with it its own healing essence. Unconditionally love yourself. Stop browbeating or castigating your every action. Be loving toward yourself when you make a mistake. Free yourself to be your best self. Pray for yourself, and then it will be easy to love and pray for others. And as I said, my life is a journey, and that's kind of the just all-encompassing place that would be my goal. Goal isn't quite the right word, but it's kind of my epiphany. And I do live there actually a lot of times, just accepting the now. Richard Rohr has a wonderful book, The Naked Now. He has a wonderful book, Falling Upwards, which was instrumental in my journey. How it's not reaching and attaining. Sometimes it's going down in the depths of sorrow and depression, or just resting in the now, how things really are. I had written at some point when I was preparing for this podcast, I went to my folder I had stashed away for years, and I had written some notes that I thought were really important. As far as I know, they come from reading Richard Rohr's books. But one of the notes is about creative depression. Being in a depressed state isn't always bad. It's a demand for wholeness. So the motion is to be accepted and examined and not masked by medication. But with this caveat, I'm a nurse. By all means, seek medical help if you need it. God usually uses you, and you are not conscious of it. God is right, just, and fair. And I know in my words, God is not a solid. There's many words. There's as many words as there are people or languages, perhaps. And we may all be thinking about the same thing or different things. We don't really know or understand. There's a lot unknown. So a test about something, even as you go through this journey, is it convicting rather than condemning? So conviction comes from the good source. Condemnation comes from the bad source. It makes you feel guilty. The good source will never attack your value. God says, this is what is wrong. This is what you need to do. It's never going to ostracize you or expel you or condemn you. Do I sense God's peace about it? If you feel pressure, confused, you may be caught up in yourself. Like I referred to before, you may be caught up in your false self, not your true self. Does it drive you compulsively? Then it's not the right spirit. Is it compassionate? God wants to draw you compassionately? Is the spirit you're talking about drawing you? Is your journey and your search drawing you into ever more wholeness and harmony with yourself and the world around you? So I had mentioned Richard Rohr. I read the notes I took from some of his book. Some more of his very books that are very helpful is Immortal Diamond and The Universal Christ. And just some other litmus test of the psychology about cult influence. I was reluctant to use the word cult, but it actually is very pertinent. They prey on universal human needs such as belonging, purpose, and identity. They offer simple answers to complex life problems. They use mind control techniques of attention and affection to new recruits and gaslighting. I have a definition of gaslighting further on. Isolation from outside influences, making the cult the sole source of truth and community. Other warning signs are undue influence, such as excessive control, dictating personal choices, relationships, and involving finances. Black and white thinking, fear tactics such as eternal damnation, shaming, predictions of physical harm. And I talk about shame later on, but let me just mention it now. If you've never been introduced to Brene Brown's works on shame, it's amazing. So her books of Daring Greatly, and I can't actually say I've read the whole book, Daring Greatly, but I have read her whole book of Atlas of the Heart. And that is a powerful book about understanding emotions. It's been a while since I read it, but I know I just devoured the whole thing. So back to, oh, also if they don't leave any room for questions. So if questions are kind of tapped down, not really allowed, discouraged. I had talked about Newton's third law as applied to psychology. For every action and behavior, there's a reaction. So that might be why we see a little rebound effect with some people who leave a closed group. Because of all this intense projection, and I've heard some other people voice, like, it's a hard thing to carry these projections when people are telling you. I had, a text in the middle of the night at 2 a.m. woke me up saying the devil was out to get me. That's hard, a little bit hard to deal with if you aren't totally sure of yourself and sure of where you're going and been on a real psychological and spiritual journey. So I also, Richard Rohr has just been so important. I was privileged to attend several of his conferences, met people from all over the world that had the most beautiful spirit. So there are lots of people out there. We're all humans. We're all just trying to do the best we can. And I acknowledge that this river that wells up, it can be found anywhere. I was given a very beautiful dream as I left the church. And it was in the dream, I was out in space looking down on Earth, and it was completely dark. All you could see was pinpoints of light. And to me, that was the Christ spirit in anyone. It could be in the Holdeman church, it could be in any church or religion. You couldn't see how they were dressed. You couldn't even see whether they were male or female. It was just points of beautiful light. And that's my viewpoint. Is it can be found anywhere. We're all humans. So the benefits of actually drilling down deep and making difficult decisions and seeking truth is that we can be a more whole person. Decreased anxiety from social pressures, outside influences that you just don't agree with or can never meet. A feeling of wholeness, just communion directly with Christ. I'll never forget that. When I was a church member, I once had this experience that I told, in our members meetings that we had to tell, but it was very impressive. I walked outside and the sun was just shining, and I've always been an outdoor person, but it was just this warm glow. And the thought was that nothing was between me and the sun. And that's how I feel now. Nothing is between me and Christ, between the source of the universe. I don't have this layer of minister, church, whatever, dictating, or that I have to meet expectations of or answer to, and it's a beautiful feeling. And I had told the story of the wheel and the missionary, and also in my recent thinking, I don't put a name to power. I think before the printing press, before people were even able to verbalize, they knew there was a source, or they were seeking for it, or they wondered why they were here. Every indigenous population in their isolated evolution through the thousands of years had their own spiritual stories that would bring hope and healing and power to them. So it's just like the birds singing their songs. They don't all sing the same song. They don't all say the same word. We don't need to say God or Buddha for that instance. We don't need to judge. It's a lot where we were raised. There is a dark side to life and a light side. We do choose. But if it's a good spirit and they're being helped and healed and helping other humans, it's good. It's a good thing. We're all seeking wholeness and union, whether we know it or not. Some other things as on the psychology as we go along, I thought about manipulation. Using others' emotions of guilt or fear to manipulate them into compliance. That might be something to watch for. Creating a scenario where others feel guilty for something. I do think back to my mother's story in those years, how that manipulated her emotions and her reactions. Gaslighting. So later on in my life, even after I left the church in another situation, I truly experienced gaslighting. And so I don't know if anybody else has experienced this, but a psychological manipulation tactic where one person seeks to make another doubt their perceptions of reality. So they'll put a twist to things that simply are not true. It's often used in a toxic environment to maintain control and power. There's also the psychological thing of splitting. So we need to watch out for, splitting into the good and the bad. So, and sometimes I think I understand this. I'm not sure if I'm able to verbalize it very well. We can split within ourselves, or we can split that something is either good or bad. So like the church is only good, the world is bad. That is splitting. It doesn't acknowledge the complexity of middle grounds or the complexity of individual situations. So this can also happen in those interviews where the interviewee is caught in a passive, immature, and dependent position. They're the powerless one. And just like I said, where I refused to have those meetings, where it was predetermined who was good and who was bad, because there was a definite splitting that had already happened that I understood. So, and the Holdemans obviously hold that in their one true church doctrine. I am coming to a close here. So just, I talked about Brene Brown, understanding shame and shaming, and just encouraging people to read more about the shadow and integrating it, and just understanding it so it doesn't hold such a hook in your mind. Once again, watching for reactions based in fear. And I just have a heart, I have a real heart for women in any situation like that. That was a huge thing for me to, it was super scary. I did this clean thing. It was before the 4th of July in 2013, made the phone call. And to be honest, my clean cut involved just having my hair cut decent. So I look decent, getting a whole new wardrobe. Like, let's just do this. And it was scary driving all the way to the city without a hickory ring on. It was a huge, like, but it gets better. You know, you begin to feel normal, and it's so much better than having this split. Like, I think of it almost every day. I am grateful and blessed to not have to think that I have to put something on my head to be worthy. I think it's a real psychological issue that people would understand if they would think about it. I would also just like to I would like a bit of acknowledgement about perhaps the harm and deception that a society like the Holdemans has caused. Everybody is fully aware of certain suicide. I didn't talk to you about them earlier, Weylin, but there are several suicides in the area that I think were, the church had culpability. No matter what you can say about the individual, whether they weren't able to face up to their shadow side, it's still the whole system that caused and made it the way it was. It just made it the way it was. And just, you know, I don't know if I love people in the church. I hold the ministers more accountable than the lay people. I think the pastor position is a very dangerous one.
Mhm.
I just think it, it's dangerous. And I don't know if they really realize it fully. And just encouraging whoever's listening just to be still and listen to their real thoughts. Listen to them, understand, try to understand, always grow, just grow. I referring back to, not just a word of God, perhaps as being the source. I do love a book called Without Buddha, I Cannot Be a Christian by Paul Knitter. I have done meditation. It's very releasing to get out of the monkey brain and just let things go. Just let it go. To me, that is the most helpful thing of negative emotions. Things aren't the way you want them to be. We're all here just doing the best we can. And I would say that I only recently have I reached out and started going to another church. I chose a local covenant church, and my heart and mind have been totally nourished and healed, and I have landed in an amazing space. They they're just so lovely and loving and accepting and non-judgmental. They do all the same things that Holdemans do. They have their meal trains for people who've had a baby or funeral. And the amazing thing was, one of the Holdemans will always say they're the only ones that do feet washing. So I was totally taken back. They do communion on the first Sunday of every month, and that was a liberating thing too. Like, just Christ said, "Do this for me." We can just do it with this whole drama of delving down, trying to scrub our soul, which never really works anyway. But this time they actually had feet washing, and how they did it was families could go up together and wash each other's feet, or you could have a partner. I have another friend there that has come from a similar background. And through this journey, I've met other people who have left other religions, such as very strict Baptist or other religions, who have been on a very similar journey. And so she and I went up and washed each other's feet, and that was the most holy moment. It's not a big deal. There's not big fanfare. Some people were leaving if they didn't feel comfortable doing it. And the Holdemans aren't the only ones who continue to wash each other's feet. And the sermons are nourishing. It is lovely. There are holy people everywhere you look. So do you have any questions? I don't even know how long we've went on.
I didn't look when we started either.
Yeah.
Let's see. I did have some. Just when you were talking about the filter.
Uh-huh.
My experience of that was that before I left the church, I found it nearly impossible to resist the temptations of
Mm-hmm.
of the internet.
Uh-huh.
And what was interesting to me is after I left the church, that has completely changed, and it doesn't. I have all the access I want,
Mm-hmm.
and there's very little need for it anymore.
Exactly. That psychological hook of thinking it's too wrong, and then it creates this dark energy.
And
Exactly.
it's a
Yes.
constant attraction then.
Yeah. Exactly. I totally hear you, because it's when I don't have any desire to do all those things that they think are so wrong anyway. So,
Yeah.
and it's not the church that's keeping me from doing it.
Yeah. You were
Mm-hmm.
talking about a difficulty for a woman to leave, and I had a few more thoughts on that.
Uh-huh.
It gets to me it gets even more, maybe more intentional, more scary. I'm not coming up with the word I'm really looking for here, but
Mm-hmm.
most women don't have an education
good enough to land a job that could support them. And you've got all of these things that, so you said go buy a new wardrobe. Well, if you're thinking of leaving and suddenly you need to make an income, but you don't have an education, and all of those things, to me, they snowball, and they make leaving look so incredibly difficult that your brain can't really process it. I even found that as a man, I started thinking about that I couldn't use the church insurance for my house, and I couldn't use the church insurance for my car. And then it snowballed from there, and it took me a long time to get used to losing all of those things.
That is a good point. I hadn't even thought of that. I had to change from MUA to Farm Bureau for my house, and it cost more money. And I was privileged to have a nursing career. But, the interesting thing is, even when I was at a conference in Albuquerque one morning, I got a call from a married woman here, a Holdeman married woman, just in dismay. And I was the only person she could think of to call, because she was going in circles with all these questions as well. And I just offered her a listening ear best I could. But that is an excellent point, that I was in a position as an independent individual to leave in the way I did. Very true. So the interesting situation in my situation was, I built a house here in the local town, and my parents, because of their farm financial difficulties, actually ended up living with me. So they lived with me, and by pooling our resources, that helped us all out, because we came from very poor roots. Let's just be clear. And but my dad absolutely never said anything negative. And when he died, even, all he said was, I want all my girls to be in heaven. And what else would a father say? And he didn't say it pointedly. And then he kind of shook his head. Well, I don't know if I kind of defended. I felt a little defensive, perhaps. I don't even remember what I said. But then he was just in his morphine fog, because he had cancer, and we were trying to keep him comfortable. He just shook his head and said, I don't understand at all. And I think that is a very good place to be. I don't understand it all. But I do know that people who think they know it all are not where I want to be, and they're probably harmful. And there again, back to the 80-20%, it can work just fine for some people. And this is just my story and my journey. But I have also been the subject of pretty negative psychological projections, even since me leaving, that I understand all is not well. All is not well under the surface, even if they try to portray it is.
Yeah. I don't want to tell anybody else's story here, but I have listened to several people on this podcast describe things that happened to them, and they were stories that I heard years ago in the church. I heard this horror story of this person did this thing, and they're so sinful, and they were just reveling in sin. And then I hear it on the podcast, the person it actually happened to. And it looks very, very different. They were not, it was maybe one of the worst experiences of their lives. And brought about by a lack of understanding and a lack of maybe sexual education or whatever.
Right. Yes.
And the church tells this story of, they did this thing that was so immoral, and then you hear the story and they're like, this horrible thing happened.
Well, some of that, I think that's a worthy thought, and I don't feel qualified. I'm a nurse, so I have, dealt with lots and lots of people. But I think that there is a problem in the church, and I don't know how deep it is. And I hate to even say, I hate to be the naysayer and say this is such a huge problem. But I'll tell you what, it's that dark shadow side. So every time you're going to portray this wonderful thing, like we're the only one true church and we're pure and we keep ourselves pure by expelling people. And like I've had personal experience in the area, some really deviant behaviors that have even affected people in the area.
Yeah.
So, and I don't know how prevalent it is now. I thought, well, maybe it's years ago, like my poor mother, but I don't have a clear handle on that, but I know it's there. And even, and I speak for myself, we don't get teaching. I don't know what people do now. Maybe it was just my parents, but I think it was how it was back then, because being the sensitive person I was, youth life was a strange thing to navigate.
Yeah.
There were so many nuances, and yet, so I'll be honest, like in my youth life, I was kind of maybe in the wild group a bit for a while when we listened to radios and had courtship. So everyone would get up on those meetings and confess courtship. And wasn't really condoned, and yet I don't know. I never could navigate it very well. I probably for myself, from a very young age, I chose to be a nurse probably when I think it was about when I was deciding which path to go, teacher or nurse. There was only those two. I remember walking down the country road, and I must have been early teens. I must have been like 14, because I started working out when I was 14, cleaning houses, and then I became a CNA when I was 16. So I believe I made that decision to go on the nurse path before I became a CNA, and then just followed that path through. But I never was enamored by wanting to get married. So I always had this thing about, and I don't know how it is for everyone, but it seems like they're pretty motivated to get married. And, but I'm not sure how, does it really boil down to just wanting to get married sometimes and not fully a whole? So then maybe that's why things are a little unstable, and then kind of these lackluster marriages, and then that I don't know. I don't know. But those were the feelings I had as a youth. It was an odd thing to these 1,000 people weddings. I absolutely hated, where you went from one group to another saying nothing. I absolutely hated it to the core of my being, whether it was because I'm an introvert or because I was highly sensitive to just the superficiality of it all, having to have new dresses, high black heels, your black covering. And I never could navigate it. Never could, for whatever reason.
I know for myself, the marriage issue, from the time I was quite young, I believed that was the most important thing you could do. And so I also had very, very low self-esteem. And so my entire youth life was trying to make sure that I was going to get married, because I was so sure that if I didn't have something planned, I would never actually get married. And so, yeah, that's all my youth life basically consisted of. Well, that was a lot of my focus internally.
Oh, yes.
And I didn't ever really, for some reason, I didn't ever look in my own youth group for someone to connect to like that. So I went to youth with these people, but I was always focusing on someone trying to make sure I was going to get married, because it scared me so much. I had so much anxiety about never getting married.
Absolutely. Yes. Because it's a part of the whole social fabric. I mean, I as a single person felt terrible lots. You know, you go to a wedding and nobody would sit across from you because it would put the whole male female thing off kilter down the table. You know, so yeah, and feeling I'm with you there. I don't know, you know, now I don't know if it's even possible for me to evaluate my self-esteem because I just am who I am. But back then I had a lot of pain. I just had a lot of pain right here a lot of times. That's all I know.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I would say very much that way. That's why I say it was so strange. Because, you know, sexuality is so suppressed. You can't go out one-on-one, which I think in our state of mind, being conditioned that horrible things would happen, we were preconditioned that it might have if we were just one-on-one. So like,
Right.
but I look at the world and they aren't perfect either, but I see many marriages who have lasted a long time, or I see in college just friendships. And you know, there are these echelons of society, I will just be honest, and I've tried to analyze it because I work with a lot of single mothers who struggle, and I think, you know, they're making poor decisions. But then it seems to me like it's kind of money based. Then you get these college educated who get really stable relationships, have good careers, have good lives apparently from the outside, but it kind of seems to depend on their income, to be honest. I don't know if that's 100% sure, but I never could navigate the youth thing. Like it was all just too odd.
Yeah.
Because there are all these underlying currents. Because it was almost hypersexualized is what my mind tells me, to be honest. Like the way, and even now, so the big thing about the dressing, I see these Mennonite girls now, and it looks like a harlot. I am serious. The way they put their hair and the bun up here, and they're very form-fitting dresses, and now they're knee length. They used to be, now I was from the 80s when they had great big football, I call them football sleeves. I never did that. I was like, I have no need for football sleeves. I was wearing sleeves like this then. And then hems up, hems down, like it's a symptom of something. It's a symptom. It's a symptom of having to fit in. It's a symptom of some type of dissatisfaction of how it is. Because to be honest, the women I go to church with, they just dress normal. Yeah. And you talk about not being able to find a new wardrobe. I mean, I have nothing against, you know, coming up, I have nothing against going to secondhand stores. And you don't need much. I was just thinking last night of the little closet my mom and dad had, and their clothes were all in there. And I have way too many clothes now, to be honest, because I was able to buy them. But you don't need much. You don't need as much like this, dressing like this, as you did then when you had to have a new dress for everything. And I still see it. I don't think it's went away because I still hear about it.
Yeah.
And here's the other thing. I don't know. You can cut this part out if you want. But I have a heart for the split families. So if one, let's say the father is expelled and the mother is in the church and they have children, they're never invited. Those poor children have got a lot to overcome it, even if they're staying in the church. Like, and I think it happens, you know, it happens with poverty. I remember hearing someone I work with come to work and say they were so poor, all they had was pancakes the whole week. And the deacons came over and were trying to tell them, well, you could cut here and cut there. And they had cut so far beyond what these, And I think that's the dangerous piece of the deacons. Maybe it's different now. Maybe there's some, but the deacons and the ministers, they're always put in the position of being the ones. And I often have wondered what it would be like to be from their standpoint. I think it gives them a little dopamine in their brain. I really do think it does, being in that position. I think that's a dangerous, that's what I said before. It's a very dangerous position.
Mm-hmm.
But I have a real heart for those people. And don't even get me started on the avoidance issue and the whole wedding thing. Like I know it just is a symptom of that discomfort psychologically with it. So years ago, they would have this separate table for the expelled, and then they would set the worldly people there too. But now they can't hardly tell, so they just mix us all up. But then when it comes to the wedding, if it happens to be a couple who are the parents, they do these weird gymnastics, like they'll take a board out of the table.
Mm-hmm.
They'll even take a board out of the table and just have a swoop in the tablecloth. Or even I've heard of that in people's homes, just to kind of have that little there yet. They don't want to be thought of as not holding up the doctrines. But they don't quite, that was one thing I made really clear when I was expelled. We are not going to set anybody at any different table. Like, who's to say who's good and who's bad anyway? We're all just, I mean, they're over there and they're over there. Like, which table is good and bad? Who's to say?
Yeah.
And don't even get me started on the holy kiss. You know, I was so uncomfortable with that from the very beginning. Never made sense at all. But you know, I think that, so maybe out of my whole journey with this podcast even, and the research I've done and collected there, is there is a psychic toll to this. And I would have women get up on this members meeting and say how depressed they were. And I was like, you look lovely. You have a lovely husband and children. And why are you depressed? So I guess that's my heart. I guess if I were to speak from my heart, that would be I have a little ache in my heart for especially those situations, the effect on the children of these split homes. It's not their fault. Why don't people invite them? Why, if they were in a loving community, they would be enwrapped and enveloped. And my mother, in her journey, in her older life, she had a few older ladies she would have tea with. But my understanding of that whole situation, and I don't have any details. I haven't ever really had anybody tell me. All my dad said once was, well, the minister that announced it just blurted out. I guess he blurted out personal details. And there again, that psychological tick, or that shadow coming around to bite you. So somehow in that meeting, he divulged personal things that were embarrassing for my mom. And to live with that all your life. And it's the same way for me. Those people who are brought up in church for those things that I learned later, gossip filled in the details, I can't forget that. I can't forget it when I see them.
Right.
And that is a piece that I think is harmful for just humanity in general. Remove the barriers. It's just harmful. And I personally never wanted to be any part of that ever again. Anything, raising your hand to say this 9-year-old has met Christ, raising your hand to expel somebody, it's not for me.
Yeah.
At all.
Yeah.
So I guess partly, it would just be encouragement for people who have left to just work toward wholeness, whatever that looks like for you. People who are having questions, like you've even said, perhaps that they're becoming less afraid about questioning.
Mm-hmm.
Perhaps there is possibility within the structure to have wholeness. I just look at the covenant church I'm going to as, I'm telling you, I have landed in a wonderful place. I mean, they don't even require membership. They don't like to come to communion. You didn't have to be a member. You
Mm-hmm.
just had to basically want to and believe kind of in that, probably that verse that says Christ, I don't know if commanded is the right word. But he just said, do this in remembrance of me. That's all you
Right.
needed. That's all,
Right.
that's all you needed. And they have, they have these papers they give out at the beginning of the Bible studies that just respect everyone's voice, keep it confidential. Gossiping is so harmful. And I mean, they did in the spring, we did an in-depth. Every Thursday morning I went and we studied 1st and 2nd Peter. And this was kind of a new thing to me because I had left the Bible for 12 years. I mean, I had read through the Bible when, through my church life, read rotely through it all. And I just sometimes didn't glean that much because I always had to look at it through a filter. I had to look at it through this filter of what you were told. But it was just so nourishing to me just to meet with women, to be able to say something if I felt called to listen to them, to focus on the word. And they're a very vibrant church. So they have now that I'm 55, I can be part of their crescendo group. Just older individuals who meet and go do things, but they always have a spiritual focus. Like even when we met at the local pizza place, she had a paper she would give out, and it was just kind of thoughts about, I don't even remember all the things, but they'll have some little questions to spark conversations. And then I was also part of a gathering table. You could just sign up for women, and they kind of put you in groups, and we could do whatever we wanted. I had some ladies, there was only 2 that were here one afternoon, and they keep it real low key, no expectations, great things that you have to meet. And we just talked, but it's on a real level. Yeah.
Well, I think kind of maybe what you're getting to here is that we're all looking for connection. And it seems like you've found a place where there is a very deep and meaningful connection.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that that's one thing that the church does not understand is connection. They try to connect through all of their guidelines, keeping everybody the same.
Mm-hmm.
But that's not at all what connection is about. It's so much more than that.
Or just strictly social gatherings where basically nothing spiritual or deep, from my experience, was really talked about.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I definitely hear you. Connection is important, and I have felt more enlivened since I made that connection. Like I say, we all just do the best we can. I know there are lots of you out there doing the best you can. My heart goes out to every one of you that would be listening. And, I anybody's welcome to message me if they like. I don't know how that all works. But I'm certainly not perfect. I work a lot. You know, I'm honest. I don't, but I am happy to just message back or whatever. I don't really have any answers. I kind of laid it all out and I'm on my journey. I always read. I listen to more, podcasts. I attend around Richard Rohr so that he has this daily meditation that people might be interested in. It's free. And so Richard Rohr established the Center for Action and Contemplation in Albuquerque, New Mexico. He's actually a Franciscan priest who grew up in Topeka, Kansas. But he's come to this universal view. So his base is the Catholic Church. His journey is kind of like all the rest of ours, where it's bigger. It's bigger. The spirit, the meaning of life is bigger than just the Catholic Church. And it was really, really enlivening to read his books and listen to him. I believe he still has YouTube has a lot of his presentations. Ilia Delio. So Ilia, Ilia Delio, Delio, is a Franciscan nun, actually. But her view of cosmology and the expanding, the birthing of Christ. We're all participating in the birthing of Christ in this, our lives on earth. It just is really profound to think about. Kind of like Weylin and I think we talked about this before the podcast, kind of my view, I'll speak from my view, that Christ was spirit embodied. And we are spirit embodied. Don't be scared of that. Don't put up walls. Because it's powerful. And it's biblical too, if you want to go that route. We're the hands and feet of Christ. Often, I said originally often, when I received help, even just in physical help, I don't know, it often came in the form of another person. It comes through nourishment too. I mean, I went through this long journey with my father, who had stage 4 prostate cancer and died in 2017. And so I had left the church in 2013. And I can't remember, it must have been several years later. Let's see, it must have been 2014 when he got his diagnosis. But that was a very, very difficult journey. He's very dear to me. My mother and father, I want to honor them. They were just very dear, sincere people. And my dad, so I walked with him through that journey, and it was not easy. At first he did pretty good, but it was chemo every 3 weeks, going and sitting there for hours, and then just seeing the gradual decline, and then knowing it was getting close. And it's painful, because he was a very important person in my life. He was a very dynamic person, always interested in life. Right up to the last week before his death, he was creative and working on this train model thing. He was interested, engaged in life. So one of the things that might be helpful for people, so through my nursing, I've taken a lot of different courses, leadership courses. One of them was actually being a fellow through Leading Age Kansas through my work. It was an 18-month course. It got altered by COVID, but we still met by Zoom. But one of their things in the beginning was to come up with a vision of your life. And they actually had a whole questionnaire kind of to focus, really think about who you want to be or what your motto can be. And mine was one of them, I had a 3-line motto. Let's see if I have it in my bathroom, so I should remember it. But one of it was to live creatively, nurture others. Those are the 2 mantras I can think of now. Nurture others, and live creatively. Let's just stick with that. But living creatively, you know, I don't know what all that, I think of it every single day, meeting problems creatively. And probably just thinking of it that way does open up something cognitively in your mind, that it maybe isn't either or. It's maybe holding the tension of the moment. Just bringing creativity somehow into your life. It can be beauty. It can be flowers on the table. It can be, to me, this whole podcast has been a creative journey, to be honest.
Mm-hmm.
Just preparing for it. And it put me in, you know, having a project like that does help. Like, I've been in this whole contemplative state of mind for how long now? I don't know how long it's been, Weylin. A month since
Mm-hmm.
I reached out and said I was finally ready to do it. So, but maybe thinking of something like that for yourself. It does take work. It does take mental energy. But it can be meaningful
Mm-hmm.
for each of us. I'm just throwing that out there. And in my work, I can't remember when I said this, but I work with a lot of underprivileged people, and they struggle. I just see how they struggle. But I do try, and I don't know that I always attain it, because I have a lot of internal tensions sometimes. It's difficult working in healthcare now, but that is the mindset I go to work with every single day. And I try to, in some way, validate people. And I have to work with my Holdeman condition judgmentalness, but I think I've come a long way in 12 years, to be honest. I don't mind people who have a lot of tattoos, or
Mm-hmm.
I just throwing that out there. Or have a single child, have a child, or they're beautiful people. I think you touched on that before too, about the sexuality in the church. Like, oh, you look at it one way and this is so horrible. But what was the generational trauma? So
Mm-hmm.
that's a whole nother thing. For a while there, I was delving into, and it was pretty interesting. I was delving into my genealogy. I had never looked back, but I went on Grandma Online, and I went back like to the 1600s. It was amazing. But then the scary thing is, in the Mennonites, and this is maybe something they need to look at, speaking as a nurse, it's a little super scary on the genetic side, to be honest. You put in two names and they can be related in 22 different ways, even though it goes a ways back. So I'm not sure. I'm thinking that any really closed society has got to have some reckoning at some point.
Yeah.
Probably.
Yep.
I mean, and I think they do see it now, perhaps in illnesses. I don't know of the whole gamut, but diabetes, for one, is genetic. So, and it can come, you can just pretty well follow it through the genealogy. But generational trauma. So there may be some interesting facets that are a part of the Holdeman Church that are generational trauma that are not recognized. One just small piece that stood out to me when I was kind of reading about their difficulties back in Russia were they always kept their churches away from the main roads, and they never had a steeple, because that would note them as a church, and then they would be a target. So up to this day, none of the Holdeman churches have steeples. They may say it's for some other reason, but that kind of just stood out to me as one symptom. And they were very closed back then. They did not mingle with the other people. They had their own language. I've read all the stories, and I don't know if I can just relate them 100%. About what all kind of generational trauma maybe followed them from Russia. But the interesting thing is, I'll say just one last thing here. I think that the Holdemans have this opinion that they're well thought of by the secular people around them. And I hate to make them aware, but that is not so.
Right.
The people around pretty much see, self-righteousness doesn't look pretty on anybody. So they can just pretty much not have pride in that fact for sure. They'll say they're wonderful people. So the interesting thing is, I was friends with a local lady who's a historian, and she actually has a little angst coming up. They're going to have some on the 23rd of August. They're going to have some presentations commemorating the 150th anniversary of the Mennonites coming over from Russia. And as this woman told me, she said, we're all Mennonites to begin with. We're all Mennonites. And then she's kind of leery. She's having a couple of Holdeman Mennonite speakers. And she, I don't want to divulge anything because in our prayer groups and so forth, we keep that confidential. So I won't go into details, but anytime that comes across like we're the only ones, we carried this candlestick, that is not palatable to anyone else at all. And so she actually had some worries that some offenses might be spoken at this meeting that might offend some of the attendees.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Yeah. Well, that will be interesting.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well,
very good talking with you. I so appreciate this platform and what you're doing.
Yeah. Well, thank you for talking.
Yes.
Thank you for listening. It is an honor to connect with our guests, and we wish the best for them as well as our listeners. Remember to like and subscribe for more episodes. Our People can be found on all major podcast platforms as well as YouTube. If you are interested in sharing your story, please contact us at ourpeoplepodcastteam@gmail.com. Thank you.